On August 20th, 2020, a chilling 911 call came into an Indiana police station. On the phone, a woman appears frazzled and proceeds to tell the station that she's discovered a female headless, dead body on the side of the bridge. So, how did this body get on the side of a road on a bridge in Indiana? When the police arrived at the crime scene, what they discovered was bone-chillingly horrible. They realized that the female body had been shoved under the guardrail with her legs half off the bridge and the rest of her body stuffed under the bridge. And to make matters even more horrifying, the body has no head, so the police can't identify the body. They're left to wonder what happened and how could something this awful happen? Meanwhile, around this same time, Michael Parks also called the police station to report his wife, Hope Parks, missing. This would later become very important. Michael told the police that he and Hope had a big argument the night before and that she had stormed off and gotten into a car with an unidentified person. He relayed that she had driven away and that he had not heard from her since. When asked for her description, police were horrified to discover that Hope matched the description of the body they had just found on the bridge. Police quickly asked Michael Parks if he would come down to the station and talk to the police about what had happened to his wife. Michael agreed and met the investigators at the station. They asked why Michael was making the missing persons report, to which he replied that he was worried about her. While there, the investigators asked Michael what he and Hope had fought about the night before. Michael told the police that they had fought about his son for the last couple months. Michael's son was a drug addict and couldn't keep a job, according to Michael's account. Michael then said that he brought into his house, so he kicked him out of the house. And he said that Hope did in fact want him to stay at the house. Michael then went on to say, "It got to a point where I told her to choose between me or him," and concluded by saying, "One of us had to go." After that, according to Michael, his son left. And since then, Hope has been wanting him to come home and live with them, which has been causing tension between the couple. Michael said that he said no to his son coming home. But then Michael's son got a speeding ticket, and according to Michael, the car was still in Hope's name. Michael said that this is where Hope and Michael's argument began on that Wednesday night. Without realizing it, in this first interview, Michael made several indications of potential control issues that investigators picked up on. He has repeatedly relayed that he told his wife what to do rather than communicate properly with her. Michael went on to go into more details about the argument, reading a text message exchange off his phone. Michael said that Hope texted him and asked if he had called the insurance company. Michael said he replied no and he hadn't had time. At which point in the interview with Michael, he hands his phone to the investigator. Michael begins to display distressing body language in the interrogation room, signs that would be accurate for someone who has just lost their spouse, but also could indicate something more. Next, the investigators asked Michael if his wife has any drug or alcohol issues, to which Michael replied no, then said she's very controlling. This answer was disturbing because to the investigators, it shows how he is taking every opportunity to speak negatively about his wife. Maybe feeling that the investigators might be turned off by his answers, Michael goes on to say, "She's controlling with everyone, but it doesn't bother him." Then without it being prompted, he says, "I take medication," which seemingly comes out of nowhere, but this next part is completely creepy. Michael goes on to say, "I have anger issues, but I take medication for it." Yikes. You don't have to be an investigator to get a sudden chill up your spine with that sentence. Michael goes even further to say, "But I haven't done anything," which feels odd considering he's there to report his wife missing and supposedly has no idea that the body that was found on the bridge that morning matches Hope's description. Also, because Michael appears to be oversharing, which is something people do when they are attempting to try and appear honest, it usually has the opposite effect and makes people appear like they're hiding something. Then something truly shocking happens in this interview with Michael. While the investigator is trying to reassure Michael that all families fight, Michael interrupts the investigator and says, "I want to hurt him." Wait, what? Then Michael says to the investigator, "I hate to say this and have it on recording, but I do. I want to hurt him." Wow, so Michael came into the police station because of his missing wife, and now he's saying he wants to hurt his son? He goes further to say that Hope and his son were so close that she would do anything for him, and that's what makes him mad. Michael continues to try and paint his wife and son as being toxic and the problem. He went on to indicate that Hope was an enabler for his son, and said how angry that made him, which actually established a clear motive for why he might want to hurt Hope. The investigator goes on to ask about the driver of the car of the supposed vehicle that Hope got into, but he tells the investigator that he didn't see what they looked like and shakes his head aggressively. What's strange is that Michael seems to care more about his marital issues and painting Hope as toxic than the fact that his wife might have just been found dead bed that morning. The investigator asks if Hope has ever been known to step out of their marriage or if there was anyone that she would run to. But Michael keeps saying no repeatedly. When asked why Michael decided to call the police today and not wait till later to report Hope missing, he responded, "My emotions." Then he says, "I am very worried about her." But as he says it, he stutters and his eyes drift off. The detective says, "We may have found her, but we're still looking into that." At which point Michael looks away from the investigator and fidgets uncomfortably. Then the detective asks Michael, "What made you think that something had happened to her?" Michael hesitates before he answers, then says, "I think it's just stress. I didn't think anything happened to her, just worried. I wanted to know where she was." Michael seems uncomfortable, but devoid of the sadness that one would expect from a husband. Then the investigator asks Michael if he will sign consent papers for their cars and property to be searched. Normally, it would require the police to get a search warrant, but if Michael consents to the search, then the police and investigators don't need it. While Michael is asked if he will consent to the search, he continues to appear uncomfortable by fidgeting and even putting his head in his hands, but eventually signs the papers and agree to let the officers search his house. They scan the exterior before thoroughly searching the inside for any clues as to where Hope may have gone on the night that she supposedly disappeared. But what the officers would find in and around Michael's house would only raise more questions about Hope's disappearance, questions that investigators hoped Michael could answer for them. Following the break, detectives brought Michael back into the interrogation room, hoping that he would shed some light on their unexpected findings. The investigator started with the question, "Do you know anybody that would want to hurt her?" Michael replies a soft no to that question. Investigators then asked, "Was she close to anyone at all? Somebody that would..." Then Michael cuts him off and says, "She knows how to piss people off, I can tell you that." Then he smiles inappropriately. The interrogator clarifies with Michael, "She knows how to piss people off, or you know how to piss people off?" To which Michael cuts him off again and says firmly, "No. She knows how." That seems like a crazy thing for Michael to offer up to investigators that are literally investigating his wife's gruesome murder. How can someone talk so callously about their wife that they just found out might be dead? Not only dead, but possibly beheaded and dropped on the side of the road. This is a woman that Michael was married to for well over a decade, and he's making jokes to the investigators? That is just so chilling and suspicious. Then the investigator drops a bomb on Michael. "We found some blood at your house. Would there be any reason why there would be blood at the house?" Michael immediately retorts, "Me, I cut myself." Then shows his fingers and legs to the investigator. He shows the detective a particular finger and says, "Like my finger, I smashed my finger." Then the detective says, "There was some blood located in the garage." Michael quickly offers up, "Yeah, that would be when I smashed my finger when I was doing my transmission. You say you saw the motor and stuff in there, didn't you?" The detective nods and averts his eyes. Then Michael makes another joke. He says, "You see the truck? It's a badass truck." Wait. Michael is making comments about his truck a second after detectives tell him they found blood in his house? Wouldn't that at least freak you out a little bit? Then the investigators really go for it with Michael and tell him, "So this is the point where you really need to step up to the plate and tell us what happened. It was at your house where something happened to her." Then Michael says, "Not with me." Then the investigators say there's no one else it could have been. Michael affirms, "I don't know what to tell you." He confirms to the investigator, "You're saying I did something." The detective replies, "Yep, and we're just trying to figure out, obviously you're not a bad person. You worked, you got 2 kids with her, and you lived a long life with her." This comment is a strategically placed pacifier, since if Michael gets too upset, he might close himself off or request a lawyer, which would immediately end the interview. Then Michael says again, "I didn't do anything. I swear to God, I did not do anything." Which might sound convincing, but swearing to God serves a similar function as a qualifier here, and is used as an attempt to add credibility to a statement. The interrogator then goes on to say, "Well, part of it is, I said we went through the whole house. We found everything." But Michael simply replies, "What's everything?" The detective just says, "Her." Wow. That would send a bone-chilling shiver up anyone's spine. The detective continues, "The rest of her." Michael just says, "Okay," in a manner that is too calm to be comforting. Again, the investigator has just revealed that they found blood and a body part of his wife in his house, and all he says is okay? It's beyond comprehension and completely unnerving. Then Michael says, "So what?" And detectives say, "Her head, and we found everything." At which point Michael leans back and rubs his eyes. A very dull response for someone who just found out their wife's head was found in their house. He then exhales deeply, which is more a reaction of exasperation than grief. He also hides his face with a hand, which could be a way for him to hide something that the face might give away. Hope's head is obviously the most incriminating thing that officers found inside the home. However, that's not all they found. An exterior search of the property yielded several blood smears on the gravel in front of the garage door, in the grass next to their back patio, on the wood floor of the patio itself, as well as on the ramp that leads up to the patio. Blood smears as well as bloody footprints are found inside the garage. A bullet casing was also found in the grass. The interior of the home was very clean and well kept. That is, until officers got to the basement. Spots of blood were visible on the steps that lead down into the cellar. Continuing down the stairs, it became apparent that there were drag marks across the dirt that covered the concrete basement floor. Large bloody zip ties and torn pieces of plastic were also found in several locations around the basement. Down there among the dust and discarded equipment, officers made the most unsettling discovery of the investigations: Hope's severed head. It had been wrapped in plastic shopping bags and placed in a shallow hole in the basement floor and covered in dirt and debris, hidden by a pile of flex ducts that had been arranged on top of the grave. Circumstantial evidence present makes it apparent to everyone that Michael had something to do with his wife's murder. However, there is not any physical proof that he is the one that hurt Hope. Back with Michael in the investigation room, the investigator tells Michael, "Obviously you're not a bad person. You've provided for your family. So what happened? What snapped?" The investigator is clearly trying to get a confession from Michael, and with all the evidence against him, it would be hard to prove he wasn't involved. And the investigator is suggesting a lighter version of the events, that Michael simply snapped under the pressure of his controlling wife. This version paints Michael as a generally good person, maybe even as a victim himself. However, if Michael were to go along with this reasoning, he'd still be admitting to killing his wife. Michael then offers up, "I know what you're thinking, but no, it wasn't me. I'm sorry." The detective then asks Michael point blank, "Who else could it be?" Then Michael says, "Talk to my son." Up until this point, Michael has gone out of his way to paint his son in a negative light. Then the detective says, "There's nobody that's gonna hurt your wife like you would hurt her. And that's what happened to her." Wow, so the investigator basically told Michael he was guilty, and then Michael just went silent. And after a little silence, he says calmly, "It wasn't me. Nope." Then again he repeated, "Nope." An innocent person would be forceful and adamant with their answers when being accused of murder. Then Michael stands up and says, "Talk to my daughter." The investigator asks Michael to have a seat, but Michael continues to pace a little while. Clearly the weight of everything is coming down on his shoulders. Pacing is a nervous act done to release tension. Then the detective comes back at Michael again and says something happened to her that night, and something happened to her at your house. You were the only one there at your house that night. Then Michael says, "I guess this is the part where I need a lawyer because you aren't listening to me." But because Michael doesn't directly ask for a lawyer, the detective is allowed to keep questioning him. By law, you have to ask directly for a lawyer before detectives have to stop questioning you. Michael says, "I'll answer the rest of your questions. I'm just saying I didn't do this." The detective just says, "Okay." And Michael goes on to say, "And you can ask me this 100 times, I'm still going to tell you I did not do this." Then the investigator says, "You're the only one at the house. You're the only one who could know what happened to your wife. Okay, you didn't mean to do this to her." Michael puts his arms across his body to close himself off, but the detective continues, "We're trying to ask you, how does she lose parts of her body in your house?" To which Michael says, "No clue." The investigator then says, "You have a clue." To which Michael says, "No, I do not." Then the investigator gets more aggressive and says, "There's nowhere else for us to look. There's nowhere else for us to go. There's no one else for us to talk to about this." At which point Michael states, "All right, I want a lawyer," which immediately shuts down the investigation. So the detectives are no longer allowed to ask Michael any questions. Michael asks for another smoke break but is refused, then gets up and anxiously begins to pace around the room. When he sits back down, he sits on the side of the couch that's the furthest away from the investigators. This clearly communicates his desire to escape the situation. Finally, the awkward silence is broken up by the police entering the room to put Michael in handcuffs. Seems the investigators did not believe Michael's story, and his hopes of removing himself from the situation are dashed. As Michael is being arrested, he says the last time, "You guys got this all wrong." Michael is then escorted to a holding cell by a pair of armed police officers. Over the next few days, the officers continue to investigate Michael's home and cars. They follow up on potential leads and speak to Michael and Hope's friends and family members. The detectives have lost hope on getting any valuable information out of Michael. That is, until 4 days later when he unexpectedly asks to speak to detectives again without a lawyer present. So the detectives come to see him in a prison investigation room. This interview takes place the following Monday. Now, Michael is dressed in an orange jumpsuit and the room is much more intimidating. So Michael begins to tell the story again. He starts by saying, "It was Tuesday. I got off work early at 3:30 p.m. I was home by 4:15 p.m. Kids came over. We, Hope and Michael, were arguing. I was on the back porch after everybody left. I was gonna shoot a groundhog. I have groundhogs in the backyard. I do. My neighbor does. He never came back. I went to discharge the gun. I shot 3 rounds into the tree. I went in the house. I was going to clean the gun. I sat at the kitchen table. It went off. There was still 1 round in it. She, Hope, hit the floor. She was fixing dinner. I panicked. I just flat out panicked. I didn't know what to do. Wow, so Michael is basically admitting that he accidentally shot his wife, but then when he panicked, he decapitated her and then left her on the side of the road mangled and discarded? That seems like a very extreme reaction. If it really was an accident, wouldn't he have tried to call for help? That being said, in the state of Indiana, accidentally killing someone doesn't make a person guilty of murder. The prosecution must prove that the killing was intentional. But Michael continues and says, there was blood everywhere. I covered it up. I picked everything up. I cleaned the mess up. I took out the garbage. Everything else is just kind of blurred. But if Hope's death was an honest accident, it still doesn't make sense that he would try to cover it up. The detectives then asked Michael, what did you do after that? Michael says, I sat there and I cried. I thought about everything that was going on with the fighting, with John, with the gun. Nobody was going to believe me. So clearly Michael has gotten to what is a very emotional and traumatic moment in his story, but he still shows little emotion in the interrogation room. Michael goes on and says, I'm sorry I lied, to which the detectives say, no. Here's a chance for you to tell us what happened. Michael says that he wrapped her in a tarp and moved her down to the basement. At that point, Michael's voice cracks like he's crying, only he doesn't display any other signs of crying. Michael adds, it's the only gun I've ever fired. The detective says, okay, then adds, the closer you are to something or somebody, you get more residue. The further away, the less residue you get when you fire the gun. She seemed to have some residue around the entry wound, so that would indicate that the gun would be closer, about 4 or 5 feet. So this single point of evidence puts a rather large hole in Michael's story. And if Michael can't bridge the gap between his story and the evidence, it would be nearly impossible for Michael's attorney to prove that the murder was accidental. Michael retorts, I don't know how close she was standing. I know that she was getting ready to fix dinner. That's all I know. And when I sat down, I had the gun in my hand. That's when it went off. I'm telling you, I did not do it deliberately. Then the detectives relay that the autopsy doctor put in their report that it was a contact wound, meaning the gun would have to be very close to Hope's head, which means the barrel was close to the skin when it went off. Then the detective tells Michael, there's going to be 2 schools of thought on this. 1, somehow you tragically shot her with the muzzle of the gun touching the back of her head. Or 2, there was a disagreement. There was an argument and a snap bad judgment. Clearly the detective is trying to lure Michael into a confession, but Michael immediately begins shaking his head and says there was no argument. The detective clarifies, since Michael has admitted to arguing with his wife multiple times, no argument after everybody left? The detective goes on and says, were you still just upset from the argument earlier? Because people on the outside looking in, at that point Michael says, I don't care what anybody else thinks, which clearly he does. It seems like he not only wants the detectives to believe him, but to like him. Michael then gets visibly agitated and comes back with a fury of defensive points, saying he doesn't know where she was standing or how she was standing, but affirming once again that he did not stick the gun to the back of her head and pull the trigger. The detective repeats back to Michael, and all I'm telling you is that the science proves differently. Michael then firmly says, then she was closer than what I thought. The detective corrects Michael and says, a lot closer. Michael fires back at him and says, that's all I can say. He gets visibly upset. His hand trembles. He reaches for the water bottle. The detective tries a different angle with Michael and says, you didn't want her to die. Then Michael trembles out a no. The detective continues, but circumstances led to her death. What was the mental capacity of you at that time? Were you so enraged by an earlier argument that she mouthed off something and you didn't know what you did? The detective is offering Michael a way out by suggesting that his actions were not his fault, which clearly they absolutely were his fault, but the detective is trying to put Michael at ease to maybe get him to confess. The detective asks Michael, kind of a Tasmanian devil kind of event after she's on the ground. Michael raises his hands in the air and shakes them. The detective answers his own question and says, you lost it. Then the detectives try a different angle. They ask Michael if he's ever had any trouble with his gun going off without warning. Michael answers, not that I know of. Michael then says, I didn't even have it that long. Another interesting confession. Because if Michael had recently purchased the gun, it could show that this murder was premeditated. Then the detectives begin questioning him about the details of dismembering his wife. But Michael says he doesn't remember many of those details. Maybe to preserve himself, or maybe because he doesn't want to come off like a cold-blooded killer. Then the detective tells Michael that there's no way, given the science, that the gun went off in the way that Michael had described. So Michael quickly says that he doesn't remember all the details, but he does know he didn't do it on purpose. The detective questions Michael further if his actions were reckless, to which he agrees that they were in fact reckless. Unbeknownst to Michael, by doing that, he just admitted to reckless homicide. In an attempt to clearly proclaim his innocence again, Michael retells the events of the evening and adds that Michael and Hope were in fact fighting when the gun went off, a detail he had denied before, which means that by admitting they were arguing at the time of Hope's death, it gives Michael a clear motive for killing his wife. The detective finally tells Michael that all he wants to know is why he killed his wife, and tries to pressure him by saying that his children will also want to know why he did it too. And in the course of recounting events, Michael attempts to blame his son in some way for the argument and subsequent shooting of his wife, even at one point admitting, "That's the reason I pulled the trigger," which is the first time he cleanly admits to pulling the trigger of the gun. Then he quickly backtracks and says, "Accidentally pulled the trigger." But now, detectives have a clearer picture of what happened. They've established a motive, heard Michael admit to reckless homicide, and even say that he pulled the trigger of the gun. The detectives leave after 4 long hours of interrogating him. Following his interview, Michael was moved to Montgomery County Jail, where he sat for almost 2 years. He was scheduled to stand trial in front of a jury on May 9th, 2022. That is until investigators made a haunting discovery that basically would prove that Michael was 100% guilty of murder. It was discovered that prior to Michael's murdering his wife, he'd been doing online research on the effectiveness of bottle silencers. He also looked into whether pillows silence guns. This discovery proved that Hope's murder was premeditated and destroyed the hope of Michael receiving anything less than a murder charge. On May 6, 2022, just 3 days before he was scheduled to stand trial, Michael changed his plea from not guilty to guilty and accepted a negotiated plea deal. On May 9th, 2022, he was sentenced to 50 years in prison for the murder of Hope without the possibility of parole. This case is another reminder that domestic violence can happen to anyone regardless of their social status or economic background. Domestic violence is an issue that does not discriminate. To understand relationship abuse, we must recognize that it is more than physical violence. There are multiple types of abuse that are usually present at the same time in abusive situations, and it's essential to understand how these behaviors interact so you know what to look for. When we know what a relationship looks like and means, we can then take steps to get help for ourselves as well as better support others who are experiencing abuse. There are advocates that are available 24/7 by phone or live chat to help discuss your situation and help you determine if your relationship might be abusive. If you are in an abusive relationship, there is help available. To contact the National Domestic Abuse Hotline, call 1-800-799-7233. Thanks so much for watching. I'm Allie, and we'll see you next time on Killer Bites.